And you're absolutely right. It is good to be home. I have a special place in my heart for Stellenbosch and the theology faculty, the hospitality and care. I see familiar faces, colleagues and students from, I think, 3 years ago when I was here, and that was such a generative and fruitful set of conversations, and of course returning here. Thank you particularly to Robert and Julie. They serve as wonderful hosts whenever I'm here, as well as Nadine. I always look forward to seeing her as well. But again, just very happy to be here. And with reference to the extraordinary professorship, family, they do know how to keep you humble. I remember I told my mother, I have some great news. I was appointed to Stellenbosch University, the university that I talked about, that I resonate with, I really like. And I say, it's an extraordinary professorship. And her response was, how pompous. But it's right, but the family, they have a way of just sort of keeping you humble. But I had to at least share that antidote with you. I am elated to deliver the annual Mary Ann Plaatjies-van Huffel Memorial Lecture. Since getting this invitation, it has really been a joy to read and learn about Professor Plaatjies-van Huffel, who was the first Black woman appointed to full professorship to Stellenbosch's theology faculty. That's absolutely amazing. And it brought me great joy to read that she was also the first woman ordained in a Dutch Reformed church in South Africa against huge societal pressures. I mean, having those discussions marks her as a trailblazer. And she was a scholar who put her work in service to the church. And I think that is extremely important, I can at least say within the context of the United States, in a historical moment where there's declining trust in religious institutions, there's already a kind of difficulty in placing one's service and work to the church because of various things, but yet she did that. And I'll just say, in addition to the family, that for such a remarkable person, it is the case that she was such a gift that it also involves a kind of sacrifice of a family sharing their loved one with the world. I'm very aware of that. And so to the family, thank you for sharing her. I look forward again. I feel like I stand in her legacy, really. And I look forward to reading more about her, learning more about her, teaching her work, and the whole 9 yards. Her theological scholarship and commitment to the church deeply resonates with the work I am doing right now. So while on sabbatical, I've had a year-long sabbatical, and it has been wonderful. I have been writing a manuscript on a constructive theology of spirit, or what I refer to as a constructive theology of spirit power. And I hope to demonstrate the importance of a more capacious view of God and the world through Black pneumatic rituals and spirit practices. So that's the focus, thinking pneumatologically, but thinking about the ways in which enslaved as well as early 20th century Black Pentecostal practices allow us to reimagine God and the cosmos, and you'll hear some of that today. Now, although I cannot discuss the larger argument my book advances, I would not do that to you. I do want to tarry with one specific aspect of my argument in this lecture. One persisting problem of theology is that it is often a project of epistemic mastery with respect to God talk. Through theology, we often approach God as a concept or a being to be mastered, to be explicated and interpreted through the metric of internal coherence. Through doctrine, there is in some ways a certain kind of domestication of God, or at least ideas about God, as our theological creeds are often cast in absolute determinative ways. And I am worried about these kinds of static theological approaches, which attempt to know God solely through rational concepts, argument, and critical explanation, dismissing or excluding those experiences, beliefs, or practices that do not conform to coherent or rational theological systems about God. Moreover, these static, dogmatic approaches to God and theology track with white colonial legacies in the United States, and my project is writing within the context of the United States in particular. And so then Black religious approaches to Christian theology continue to wrestle with and then challenge these white colonial legacies and their imperial forms of unbending theological orthodoxy. So then in this lecture, I suggest that a Black feminist apophatic mysticism facilitates the de-objectification of God. That's what I want to talk about on today, this de-objectification of God that Black feminist apophatic mysticism allows. Resisting then the domestication of God, and therefore I would argue the domestication of Christian theology. Because for me, to speak of Christian theology is to first speak about God. There's dissent regarding that actually, so I'm putting my cards out on the table. This Black feminist apophatic mysticism challenges the doctrinal dogmatism and theological certainty of white colonial Christian knowledge around God that has marked the historical development of Christian theology in the United States, and I would make an argument in the West more broadly. In arguing for a Black apophatic mysticism, in this lecture, I center 19th century proto-Black feminist figure Sojourner Truth to explore how such Black mystical traditions reimagine God and the world. I also explore how Truth's de-objectification of God potentially helps Christian theology reimagine its discourse on God, offering a more cosmologically expansive and ethically responsible view of God. Black feminist apophatic mysticism then not only reckons with, in particular, U.S. slavery and its theological legacies, but also offers spirit-inflected visions of cosmological wonder needed to reimagine God in more capacious ethical ways. So first, a note on Black feminist apophatic mysticism. That's a mouthful. What do I mean by this term, right? Black women in the United States have forged an apophatic tradition of Black mysticism in the wake of slavery and its afterlives. When I say Black mysticism, I am referring to Black mystical sources that reckon with slavery and its legacies, thinking theologically about that. US-based Black mysticism is more than contemplation understood maybe in a narrow sense. It's only dealing with the mind, what the mind is doing. And it is about action in the world, right? One could even argue that one could rethink and reimagine, like Howard Thurman does, contemplation as action in the world, right? So that they're not mutually exclusive and talking about contemplation over here and action over here. Black people's embodied religious knowledge and action have not been considered as a legitimate expression within the larger tradition of Western Christian mysticism, because this Black mysticism has challenged and engaged beyond the prescribed doctrines, dogmas, and liturgies of the Protestant and Catholic churches. Black religious scholars such as Joy Bostick and Yvonne Choureau have written about the mystical spirituality of Black women, what I refer to as a Black feminist apophatic mysticism. These Black women scholars note the mystical apophatic dimensions of Black women's religiosity and practices in the United States. This tradition of Black mysticism includes phenomena like visitations, dreams, visions, conjuring, prophecy, divining, mystical travel, and healing, which enabled Black people to engage in activities to resist white domination and experience wonder, delight, and pleasure. As Choureau reminds us, this Black feminist tradition was grounded in a mystic culture and ethos that was about spiritual efficacy to fight anti-Black violence, as well as about imagining a more expansive view of God and the cosmos in which they were situated. So then for Black women who represent this apophatic tradition of Black mysticism, their fundamental concern was whether or not the spiritual practice, technology, or modality is efficacious. That is, whether it can be used as a tool, or maybe employed, I should say, as a tool in the project of building and constructing emancipatory lives and spaces in which Black women and their religious communities can thrive and dwell. Black women aimed toward spiritual efficacy, not theological mastery or certainty. Sure, Black women aim towards spiritual efficacy, not theological certainty. Does a spiritual belief and practice allow Black communities to live more creatively and agentially inside of their religious and social worlds marked by the ongoing duress of slavery and its afterlives? Black women were situated within this tradition of Black mysticism in the sense that they did not embrace or embody religious principles or truths for the sake of its coherent content or absolute certitude. Rather, Black women embraced particular spiritual practices because they were effective and emancipatory in challenging violence and trauma, as well as offering them delight and wonder in the God that they served. Religious knowledge about God and the cosmos only made sense from within the practical world that Black women were situated. This tradition then is marked by an emancipatory and heterogeneous religious path that takes seriously God's vibrant and capacious presence in a diversely material yet apophatic cosmos. And I'll be talking about, and what I mean by God's vibrant presence in a diversely material, the way in which God moves through the materiality of the spirit, the materiality of the world. We come to understand something about God in the way that God reveals God's self in history, but through the materiality of the world. But then the apophatic is, but yet there is always an excess, right? There is a residual that is left that our language cannot quite grasp or exhaust. Many 19th and 20th century Black women entertain cosmological worldviews grounded in mystical, that is material and apophatic dimensions, because their approach to spirituality is more diverse and flexible in its conceptions of divinity and the cosmos, with a focus on spiritual efficacy as an important goal of religious practice. So with that being said, on Black feminist apophatic mysticism, I focus my lecture on the Black apophatic mysticism of Sojourner Truth because she articulates an undomesticated vision of God within Christian belief and practice. Sojourner Truth was born Isabella Baumfree in a Dutch-speaking village of Ulster County, New York, in 1797. She renames herself Sojourner Truth, so from here on out, I'll be referring to her as Isabella Baumfree until I speak about this name change. She had Congolese roots and was given an Iberian Catholic name. As a young child, she actively participated at annual King elections during Pinkster celebration, which was a Black religious and cultural celebration that drew upon Afro-Catholicism and African traditional religious influences to express Black creativity and agency. Yet in her adult years, Baumfree renounces her Afro-Catholic roots for a Dutch Calvinist approach to the divine. After becoming a Calvinist Christian, she withdraws her participation in annual Pinkster King festivities and traditions, as for her, these festivities were interpreted as pagan and demonic by Calvinist Christians. However, Baumfree would eventually move away from her strict Calvinist commitments, embracing an apophatic mysticism funded by her practices of spirit, a point I will return to later in this lecture. She would rename herself Sojourner Truth to reflect her posture of religious travel and becoming amid the unrelenting violence of white Christian supremacy. And she would travel around New England in the United States, becoming one of the most important voices for the abolition of slavery in 18th century America. Yet, Baumfree, that is Truth's Black apophatic mysticism, was rooted in the pragmatic desire to not only resist white supremacy, but also delight in the spirited cosmos and God as she refashioned her life. Although Isabella's mother, Baumfree, that is mother, taught her African ancestral wisdom of an expansive God connected to nature and cosmos, Baumfree embraced her white master's Christianity as a young girl, which unfortunately included rationalizing the moral good of the institution of slavery. Yet when confronting the gratuitous violence and persisting trauma of slavery, she begins to question this plantation theology and racist morality, withdrawing to a wide open space outside where she could commune with God, a wide open field. This rural altar, or what she referred to as nature's altar, is where she began to pray and invoke God. Bostic notes that this natural altar is transformed into an emancipatory mystical space that served as a site for vital union and intersubjectivity. Under the vast sky, Bomfrey communes not with the God of the slave master, but the God of her mother, the capacious God who is immanently present and suffused throughout the cosmos, yet remains incalculable and immeasurable. Within the willow walls of nature's resources, she experiences and delights in a divine expansiveness, unlike the rigid, constricted, discursive space of white slave-holding Christianity. Bomfrey's sanctuary mirrors the brush arbor meeting places and praying grounds of African enslaved blacks in the U.S. who spoke of a God beyond white doctrinal enunciations. Bomfrey's ground, where she was in this wide open field set among nature, set within a group of shrubs by the water, served as an emancipatory setting in which she could encounter God. It is here, in this rural sanctuary, that Bomfrey received an answer to the question of slavery. She's communing with God and asking, how should I think about the moral status of this institution? And as a side note, historically, I always tell theologians, don't have historical amnesia. Historically, this was actually widespread, where many, even black clergy, appealed to sort of the doctrine of providence as a way to describe why the institution of slavery in many ways was actually important to bringing Christianity to African people. So it wasn't just her sort of wrestling, right? It seems in hindsight sort of clear to us, but there's a profound wrestling going on within the community as well. But it is here in this rural sanctuary that Bomfrey received an answer on the question of slavery, whether it was right or wrong. She talks at nature's altar, which prepared the ground for the expansion of her understanding of the divine and of herself to challenge the oppressive notions of God perpetuated by slaveholding culture. By contemplating divine presence in the shrubs, nature's altar, she receives her answer to run away, to escape. Bostic writes, and I want to quote Bostic about Bomfrey, quote, "Within this mystical space of her rural sanctuary, Isabella Bomfrey engages in the apophatic way," end quote. Every statement about God, that is the slaveholding God, was unsaid and negated in deference to God's hidden reality, yet partially seen in and through the vast material cosmos. Bomfrey embarks on a journey to abandon stagnant notions of the divine she inherited from her master. Isabella Bomfrey's apophatic mystical experience helped her truly recognize the religious, social, and racial attitudes and structures that establish and reinforced white theological grammars, which created and reinscribed racist violence and abuse. As Bomfrey's understanding of God continues to adapt and expand, she experiences a God who is not imprisoned to static doctrines, grammars, and metaphors. Her capacious imagining of the divine would eventually talk back and challenge the dogmatic, violent, theological, and racist doctrines and practices of white Christian America. Black apophatic mysticism is seen among black women such as Isabella Bomfrey, who wrestle and reckon with slavery and its theological legacies, refusing to embrace theological doctrines and practices that generate harm and death. Isabella Bomfrey's form of black apophatic mysticism rejects static metaphysics in describing divine life. She does not solely privilege theological ideas through languages of ontology. as if God categorically is a being among beings, or the spirit categorically is separate from the cosmos, which marks a lot of Christian theology in the West. Instead, her mysticism privileges the imaginative and affective dimensions of God talk. God is a verb. Bomfrey de-objectifies God. A Black feminist apophatic mysticism then de-objectifies God. The de-objectification of God matters to our statements concerning divine life and world. We never master God as noun, as object. Yet the problem of Christianity is often the problem of a closed monotheism, which refuses spiritual experiences that do not align with the dominant system of a fully knowable God. Moreover, the problem of a closed monotheism often ignores the way spiritual revelation is nevertheless always mediated and interpreted through the cultural categories given to us, which prompts the need to be more flexible, capacious, and open-ended with our theological sensibilities. De-objectifying God makes room for an expansive view of divine life that is diversely material and apophatic in character, potentially challenging abstract theological grammars. Bostic foregrounds how Isabella Bomfrey's apophatic mysticism de-objectifies the divine and subsequently allows her to experience a spiritual freedom and wonder to self-fashion in, under, and despite slavery and its anti-Black systems. After Isabella Bomfrey escapes her master, she hides in Louisiana and gets word that her former master, John Dumont, knows her whereabouts and is coming to reclaim her as his property. While hiding out, that is in Louisiana, Isabella Bomfrey confronts an existential crisis as she once again witnessed the Pinkster celebration that I talked about in the beginning, the Pinkster Afro-Dutch celebration. Bostic notes that the Pinkster crisis represents a conflict within Isabella Bomfrey, as these Afro-Dutch rituals were part of her childhood, her African ancestral childhood. As an adult, her understanding and embrace of white evangelical piety shaped her ideas of sin and consciousness. Because of her piety, she had given up alcohol, although I will say this, not tobacco, for a very long time. She drew her line. She did all this to pursue holiness and sanctification. Pinkster symbolically represented vice and sin through its African-style drumming, dancing, food, and drink, which caused Bomfrey to feel moral ambivalence toward this Black celebration based on her Calvinist commitments. Bomfrey is trying to live a sanctified life, but longs for the Afro-Dutch rituals of her youth. Yet we see Isabella Bomfrey undergoing a spiritual transformation at the Pinkster celebration, despite her rhetoric surrounding this festival as temptation and sin. Sojourner Truth actually has a narrative, and you can see this wrestling going on in her narrative where through her rhetoric, she's pointing still to the sinful nature of this celebration. But when you look at her biography and sort of later on in her narrative, you see clearly that there's also this wrestling that is happening with her. As Bostic avers, and I want to quote Bostic here, quote, Isabella catches a glimpse of the vision, the theological vision, that the ritual historically evokes. The natural impulse to survive, thrive, and seek connection to a larger community through an expansive notion of God, unquote, rather than succumb to the moral and theological evils of an anti-Black order, including its brand of Christianity. As Bomfrey fights a feeling of resignation to Dumont at this festival, she thought she'd just turn herself in. She suddenly experiences a mystical revelation of the expansiveness of God's nature. In this mystical encounter that would shift and change her life, she remarks that God was, quote, all over and, quote, pervaded the universe. She remarks that there was, quote, no place where God was not. And she further exclaims, and I quote her here, oh God, I did not know you were so big. And that's the title of the book that I have actually, I'm working on with the Spirit Power. But oh God, I did not know you were so big. At Pinkster, Isabella Baumfrie's mystical revelation expanded her understanding of a God who exists not only in the cosmic sky among the cosmic elements, but a God who is also immanently present in the material world. The power of this revelation compels Baumfree to ask deeper theological questions outside of the prescribed doctrinal rules and dogmas. She asks of this transimmanent divine presence, "Who are you?" I'm quoting her here from her narrative. It is Jesus. She notes that Jesus appeared to her not as master, but as friend. She not only embraces God as a helper through Jesus as friend, but also acknowledges a God that is all over. As her vision of self and the material world expand, her view and image of God expands as well. God is provider and Jesus is her friend, not master. As Bostick notes for Isabella Baumfree, Jesus is the approachable, immanent aspect of the divine who walks with her and identifies with her as companion in the journey. In her fellowship with Jesus, she experiences an inclusive, capacious relationality with the holy, not reduced to dogmatic doctrinal prescriptions. Baumfree's expansive understanding of God allows the ancestral teachings of her mother, that is the African ancestral teachings of her mother, to now sit alongside her own Christian evangelical piety. Some might say that are in contradiction. She now sees as completely complementary. This capacious view of God also allows Isabella Baumfree to embrace a non-hierarchical understanding of God and Jesus as co-travelers. On June 1st, 1843, on the day of Pentecost, Baumfree declares that she will now be called Sojourner Truth. Now notice then that Sojourner Truth doesn't simply engage in negation with respect to her expansive view of God. Now I'm going to say a little word what I mean by apophatic apophasis, because she's participating in the apophatic way. She's not engaging in negation with respect to her expansive view of God. For example, an infinite God cannot be named. It's not just simply negative theology in that register. Truth names the divine presence she has experienced. She asks who this divine presence is and discovers it's Jesus. However, this Jesus is not the Christology of traditional penal substitutionary atonement. This is not a Jesus that is grasped primarily or solely or first through ontological language, divorced from and hovering over material life. This Jesus is the manifestation of divine love and care, a fleshly representation of cosmic connection and solidarity. So not just human to divine relationship, but cosmic connection and solidarity. This is a Jesus understood through filial bonds of her own Black community, her own ancestral community, and not through, for example, abstract Trinitarian theology or thought. Jesus is the presence that poetically captures the pervasive way divine love and presence interpenetrate the cosmos, offering truth ways to exist and refuse a racist world steeped in violence, trauma, and suffering. So then naming God was important for Truth. Yet such naming for her did not exhaust who God was, who God is, and who God will be. A Black feminist apophatic mysticism does not mean we cannot name God. So right, for me, the apophasis is not merely negative theology or simply negation. We might make claims about God, of course, through our religious encounters, and even name God, who God is and what God does. Our communities, our traditions do this. But this does not exhaust who God is. We can only ever apprehend God apophatically, but I do not mean knowing God solely through negation. To speak of God apophatically is not to reject naming God, where doctrines and traditions can be and are important and instructive. Feminist and queer feminist theologian Wendy Farley provides a compelling view of the apophatic turn by foregrounding a Christian dialectics of naming and negation. For Farley, when we name God, we use names to make possible a relation of worship. wonder, and love. Names are not static ontological statements about God. Instead, naming is about the practice of worship and love. Naming as an act of mental attribution is an imperfect way of orienting the heart to the divine. Names can be sweet. We require names because our minds and our language, our thinking, and therefore our religious life all depend on images. Within Christian traditions, then, we name God as creator, redeemer, and sustainer, the good beyond being, mother and father, the rock of our salvation, almighty and invisible, Holy Trinity, and so much more, many names that we have within the Christian tradition. And these names usher us into a relationship with God, with a God who sees us and knows us and desires our wholeness and flourishing. To be clear, negation doesn't simply take back what one says about God. God is Father, so no, God is not Father. God is eternal, so no, God is not eternal. God exists in time, so no, God does not exist in time. This practice of negation simply implies the opposite. What this way of practicing negation, I think, does not get under is the way in which our concepts function inside of binaries, either or logic about the world. In some ways, the negation of these things just mentioned still implies a kind of knowing. One is unable to see, for example, that a discussion of God's existence, either in time or outside of time, completely misses how time and timelessness are equally irrelevant to divine and cosmic reality. Divine reality may be that, but something more. It always exceeds our concepts, so that language itself breaks up in the practice of negation. Language itself cannot capture and hold an inexhaustible God. This Christian dialectics of naming and negation, then, is a way of moving more deeply into this practice of unsaying, so that we experience a disconnect from our thoughts about the divine, opening us up to God's infinite presence that can only be met with silence, wonder, love, and prayer. And so negation expresses a deeper fidelity. Negation is not simply a list of what God is not. In this Christian dialectics of naming and negation, negation then is the negation and destruction of our own inner idols, so that the living goodness of God, God's love, can innervate our own faith and transform how we live in the world through a humble commitment to know and embrace our own epistemic limits as we embody love and justice towards others in creation. To use Farley's words, our theological and religious ideas and ideals are bridges between naming and negation, which allows us to surrender to the practice of wonder and love. Names of God can be used then in prayer as gratitude, as a kind of caressing of our beloved that is God. But through names, we are carried beyond names. Names carry us into the infinite sweetness and desirability of the divine. This dialectical practice of naming and negation then moves us into an awareness beyond discursive reasoning and speech. That is only arguments, right? Rational speech. It moves us beyond that, enabling experiences of wonder and delight in a God who confounds every tongue, yet is mediated through the flesh of the world, the materiality of the world, as irresistibly loving and desirous of our union and communion. Black womanist theologian Karen Baker Fletcher's meditations, or what she refers to as wordings about God, capture this Christian dialectics of naming and negation, underscoring the diversely material yet ungraspable dimensions of mystical encounter with the divine. In Baker Fletcher's Christian account of God, God is the intimate yet incomprehensible structure and grounding of existence. The structure and grounding of existence interpenetrates all of cosmic creation, even as it exceeds historical planetary time. So you hear some of Tillich, right, being echoed here, for those that are familiar with Tillich's work. Although for Karen Baker and Fletcher, there is this sense of wanting to retain the personal and the transpersonal, not as mutually exclusive or oppositional, but on a continuum. To speak about God as the intimate, yet incalculable structure and ground of existence is not to negate personal experiences of God. If anything, for Baker Fletcher, God might be understood as personal and transpersonal, revealed in the intimate, that's personal, ways to species and landscapes across time, place, and space, as well as the incomprehensible connective tissue that's transpersonal, that suffuses and upholds the universe. God is personal and structural, intimate and public. God is presence and symbol that suffuses our encounters with the world, yet transcends these encounters. God might meaningfully be conceived in both personal and transpersonal terms, as there is a continuum between the two poles. One might, and I'll give an example, one might speak of God as you, as we do in prayer, and sometimes as the grounding of compassion. The first is more personal than the second. Viewing God in personal terms involves a sense that God feels or apprehends the universe and responds in a loving way. Viewing God in transpersonal terms involves a sense that God is the connective thread and that holds things together, and a primordial lure toward novelty and order. I think that Christian sacred scriptures attest to both perspectives, God as personal and transpersonal. From this perspective, the operations, rhythms, and patterns of the world in their personal and transpersonal cosmic dimensions can be expressions of God. The dichotomy between intimate and cosmic falls away. And that's what I'm wanting in this, for that to sort of fall away when thinking of God in personal and transpersonal ways. Importantly, the broader cosmos, with its diverse species and material landscapes, are the evolving web of diverse agents. And God is the intimate presence, that's personal, and connective pattern, transpersonal, in whom the web unfolds, and by which the web and its diverse agents are animated. This personal and transpersonal view of God can be seen, as I said, throughout sacred scripture. The creation story of Genesis, I think, demonstrates a personal and transpersonal view of God. This personal and transpersonal relationship between God and the universe, which includes, of course, humans, might be interpreted as a relationship of interdependence marked by desire. For Christians, we may have a desire to know God, but we also desire to be known by God. For Baker Fletcher, divine presence and encounter are felt experiences of knowing and being known. As a child, Baker Fletcher longed to meet God in the peonies that bloomed yearly. She longed for God in the, quote, acorns her family collected, in the seedlings of maple trees that they called airplanes, in the fresh grapes and pears she ate from the vines and trees in a friendly neighbor's yard, end quote. Her encounter with God is driven by a desire and yearning for God and cosmic creation, an encounter that connects her body and flesh to divine presence. Baker Fletcher describes her experience of divine encounter in and through the flesh of the world. Yet divine encounter is also about a desire to be known by God, right? Not just us reaching out to know, but for God reaching to us to be known by God. Baker Fletcher describes the intimacy of God that is always luring and beckoning us. She states, and I quote Baker Fletcher here, quote, "An African folktale says God is on one's back. One cannot see God, but one needn't build ladders to the heavens to find God. God is perpetually present, always immanent. Even as God cosmically transcends particular human situations, God is present in our everyday lives, and infinite possibilities for care and healing are in our midst," end quote. Here, Baker Fletcher suggests a God who intimately seeks us out, who is on our backs, so to speak, desiring a relationship of mutual longing, love, and trust. She further affirms that God may be the ultimate cosmic grounding of our being. That's that transpersonal dimension. But more importantly, God is the intimate grounding of our being in all that is. For Baker Fletcher, to speak about God is to already speak about the primordial intimacy and desire shared between God and the cosmos. The very grounding of all creation is an intimate relation of divine desire and love. One comes to know then and be known by God through the intimate relation of God to the material world, the world of flesh, bones, tears, death, laughter, pleasure, and so much more. This way of thinking words about God resists then the impulse of objectifying God. And this comes full circle to the argument that I've been seeking to demonstrate. As if God is something in hand, something transparent and fully knowable to us. Farley discusses the problem of theology as a project of epistemic mastery of God and world. Through theology, we approach God as a concept or a being then to be mastered, to be explicated, to be interpreted. Through doctrine, there's a certain domestication of God, as our theological creeds are often cast in absolute determinative ways. We come to know something about God through who and what we can say God is. Baker Fletcher mentions this way of approaching theology, referring to this as a theology of head if it's about mastery, not a theology of heart. Theology of the head attempts to know God solely, and I'm emphasizing solely because if it wasn't about arguments, I'd be caught up in a performative contradiction, right? Because I'm offering an argument, right? But this idea of the primacy, right, is what I'm getting at, the solely portion, that it attempts to know God solely through concepts, argument, and critical explanation. But a theology of the heart also involves practicing and speaking faith through divine encounter and practices of presence. Learning who God is through yearning, desire, and other affective dimensions. So bringing in the rich affects, right, that are a part of how we come to know about God. Baker Fletcher introduces an important question. What if we imagine knowing God not solely in ways dependent on enlightenment's rational methods? What if we come to know God through our intimate experiences of desire for God, rather than simply through static philosophical and ontological statements about God? What if our experiences of God's irresistible desire and yearning to be with and for us, to offer us care and delight, beckons us toward reciprocal desire and longing? What would this alternate knowing yield in terms of its epistemic and ethical import, in terms of doctrine? As revealed in the Christian idea of incarnation, to be loved is to be known. In my estimation, the incarnation does not find its ultimate meaning in God's juridical decision to free humans from the ontological state of sin. The saving efficacy of the incarnation is about God making God's self known in uncanny desire and love. The incarnation, I might argue, is a kind of divine eros, reminding us that as we are known, we can know God, but never fully, always imperfectly. At the center of any history of divine life is a God who is the intimate grounding of our cosmic existence, being with us and for us. As we need to express care and community in all of its manifold dimensions, so God desires to express love in all ways that reaffirm God's desire to be with creation. I do recognize that any account of a God who desires us and is affected by us may challenge certain doctrines, such as the doctrine, for example, of impassibility. God's impassibility means that God is not affected by anything external to God's self. Although I would say that's probably a crude reading there that I'm doing, because at least within the context of the US, there are a number of theologians that have been trying to rethink and reimagine various doctrines like the doctrine of aseity, immutability, impassibility. So right here I'm referring to the classical sense of a doctrine of impassibility in the West. But I must agree with Farley that at the center of God's story in the Christian tradition is the presence of divine desire, a God affected by and yearning for communion with God's creation. Likewise, Farley wants to center our existential longing for the divine. What I take her to be saying is we do not first think our way to God. We feel and yearn our way to God. We try to know God through concepts and language, of course, which are representative, but do not directly correspond to God. So then for Farley, I take my cue from her, we must learn how to inhabit our ideas about God in uncomfortable ways, in large part through desire. I'm compelled by the significance of centering desire as central to the ongoing revelation of God's presence throughout the cosmos. When centering desire as constitutive of God's very life, the task of faith is not the struggle for philosophical or metaphysical certainty or complete clarity when telling the story of God. And this is deeply existential for me. I come from a Pentecostal tradition that is extremely conservative, that understands itself to be grounded in biblical literalism, without much wiggle room. And so, again, the task of faith, when it's seen as trying to achieve this kind of absolute certainty metaphysically and complete clarity in telling the story of God, that it gets sort of, I think, entangled and caught up, right, in different kinds of anxieties. The task of faith, rather, in the account that I'm offering, is about faithful desire for our beloved, that is God, for God and for others who are beloved of God, even the radical others that are different from us. Christian faith in particular is awakening to God's desire for us that is in Jesus Christ. And I talk more about that. I fill that out in my manuscript. Desire for us, and delighting in God's desire for us, as Sojourner Truth did in that wide open field in nature's altar. This delight draws us to reciprocate, transforming ourselves and our relationships at personal and political levels. An apophatic turn with respect to God brings into view the ethical significance of how we approach divine life then. The Christian dialectics of naming and negation is a twin way of perceiving God's ineffable desire for us. We can only come to know in the act of unknowing. Divine desire reveals a God who creatively engages in ineffable love. Here, love is not just the motivation of redemption, but the content of redemption. And we are released from the anxiety that these names, whether it's doctrines, traditions, and these, so they're very important, but we're released from these names doing all the work, and that we must conform our complex experiences of the world to these names. This apophatic turn, then, is a practice of cosmic desire and love because it releases us from this burden. In conclusion, most importantly, this God opens us to an undomesticated faith, back to my title, marked less by certainty and more by ineffable mystery, radical longing, and cosmological wonder, all grounded in God's love for us. Among Black women, mystical encounters with the divine often led to a God who cannot be domesticated, who cannot be mastered or tamed or fully explicated. God is not object. This keeps us humble. It keeps us from making idols of our thoughts, our concepts, even our creeds about God. And it opens us up to ways of being and living together in a pluralistic society especially, that are not shaped by the forceful assertion of dogmatic belief and religious ego, which lead to both trauma and violence. Thank you.